The 10th century. 10 mind-blowing facts about the century that learned to fight back. Picture yourself as a medieval chronicler in 901 Anno Domini, surveying the wreckage of the 9th century. You've just witnessed the collapse of every major empire, the fragmentation of Christendom, and the rise of seemingly unstoppable barbarian raiders. Your job is to record history, but frankly, you're starting to wonder if civilization itself has a future. Your monastery's library is full of accounts of Magyar terror, Viking devastation, and political chaos. The old certainties are gone. Charlemagne's empire is a memory, the Abbasid Caliphate is a joke, and every few years some new group of horse-riding nomads appears to burn down whatever's left standing. You dip your quill and prepare to chronicle another century of inevitable decline. But then, something unexpected happens. Instead of continuing their successful reign of terror, the Magyars get crushed at Lechfeld and decide to become Christians. Instead of fragmenting further, the German duchies unite under a dynasty that crowns itself Holy Roman Emperor. Instead of remaining divided, the Islamic world produces military geniuses who reconquer half the Mediterranean. Instead of staying barbaric, the Vikings establish some of the most sophisticated kingdoms in Europe. By 1000 Anno Domini, you're staring at your chronicles in bewilderment. This was supposed to be the century when medieval civilization finally collapsed under the weight of its own chaos. Instead, it became the century when medieval civilization learned how to fight back, adapt, and build something stronger from the ruins of what came before. Welcome to the 10th century, when the medieval world looked at the disasters of the 9th century and said, "Hold my ale. Watch us turn this mess into something magnificent." This is the century that proved medieval resilience was stronger than medieval chaos. Here are 10 mind-blowing facts about the century that saved medieval civilization by refusing to stay defeated. Fact number 1. The Holy Roman Empire arose from German tribal chaos, like a phoenix made of swords. The fragmented German duchies, which had spent the 9th century fighting each other and getting terrorized by Magyars, suddenly produced the most powerful empire in medieval Europe through a combination of military genius and political opportunism that nobody saw coming. The transformation began with Henry the Fowler, 1919 to 936, Duke of Saxony, who somehow convinced the other German dukes that uniting against the Magyar threat was preferable to getting systematically destroyed by nomadic horse archers. Henry's strategy was brilliantly simple: build fortified towns, train heavy cavalry, and turn the Magyar advantage in mobility into a disadvantage in siege warfare. Henry's son, Otto I, 936 to 973, took this defensive success and turned it into imperial ambition. After crushing the Magyars at Lechfeld, 955, Otto looked around and realized that with the Carolingians gone and nobody else available, he might as well claim to be the heir of Charlemagne. His coronation as Holy Roman Emperor, 962, was the medieval equivalent of fake it till you make it on a continental scale. The Otto dynasty's success wasn't just military, it was institutional. They created a system where church bishops served as royal administrators, combining religious authority with political power in ways that made rebellion both treasonous and sacrilegious. German kings who controlled episcopal appointments could govern territories too large for traditional feudal administration. The German solution to political fragmentation was to embrace it while controlling it. Instead of trying to eliminate the duchies, the Ottonians turned dukes into imperial officers. Instead of centralizing administration, they distributed it through a network of loyal bishops. Instead of fighting feudalism, they weaponized it. By 1000, the Holy Roman Empire stretched from the North Sea to central Italy, making the German kings the most powerful rulers in Europe. The tribal chaos of the 9th century had somehow produced the most sophisticated governmental system of the 10th century. Fact number 2. The Magyars went from Europe's nightmare to Europe's darling in one generation. The Magyar raiders, who had terrorized Europe for half a century, underwent one of history's most dramatic cultural transformations, evolving from nomadic horse archers into Christian kings who built cathedrals and sponsored scholarship. The transformation began with their crushing defeat at Lechfeld, 955, where Otto I's heavy cavalry finally solved the Magyar tactical problem. Faced with the reality that their military advantages were disappearing, the Magyar leadership made a strategic decision that shocked everyone. Instead of fighting to the death, they would adapt to European political systems. Prince Géza, 970 to 997, began the Magyar integration into European Christianity and feudalism. He invited missionaries, established diplomatic relationships with the Holy Roman Empire and Byzantium, and started the process of transforming Magyar tribal structure into European kingship. His son, Stephen I, 997 to 1038, completed the transformation with breathtaking thoroughness. Stephen didn't just convert to Christianity. He made Hungary into one of medieval Europe's most aggressively Christian kingdoms. He invited foreign monks, built monasteries, established episcopal sees, and created legal codes that combined Hungarian tribal law with Christian principles. The Magyar transformation was remarkable because it was voluntary and strategic rather than forced and desperate. Unlike other barbarian groups who adapted to European systems after military defeat, the Magyars chose adaptation as a survival strategy while they still had bargaining power. Stephen's Hungary became a bridge between Eastern and Western Christianity, maintaining relationships with both Rome and Constantinople, while developing distinctively Hungarian institutions. The Magyar military elite, instead of disappearing, transformed into European-style nobility, while retaining their military traditions and territorial authority. By 1000, Hungary was recognized as a legitimate European kingdom, whose king corresponded with emperors and popes as an equal. The nomadic raiders of the 9th century had become the Christian knights of the 10th century. Fact number 3. The Byzantine Empire conquered its way back to superpower status. The Byzantines, who had spent the 9th century fighting unsuccessful wars against Bulgaria, discovered that the 10th century was their time to shine by producing a series of warrior emperors who reconquered half the Mediterranean through pure military brilliance. The Byzantine revival began with the Macedonian dynasty, particularly Basil the Mer, 867 to 886, and his successors, who recognized that the empire's survival required aggressive expansion rather than defensive consolidation. They rebuilt the Byzantine military around professional soldiers rather than theme militias, and launched systematic campaigns to recover lost territories. The reconquest of Crete, 961, from Islamic forces marked the beginning of Byzantine naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. Emperor Nicephorus II Phocas, 963 to 969, followed this with the reconquest of Cilicia and northern Syria, pushing Byzantine borders further east than they had been since the 7th century. The crown jewel of Byzantine expansion was Basil II's 976 to 1025 systematic destruction of the First Bulgarian Empire. The Bulgarian Wars, which had consumed resources for over a century, finally ended with complete Byzantine victory. Basil earned his nickname, the Bulgar Slayer, through campaigns so thorough that Bulgaria disappeared as an independent kingdom for 2 centuries. Byzantine success wasn't just military, it was cultural and economic. The reconquered territories were systematically integrated into Byzantine administrative, legal, and religious systems. Greek became the dominant language, Orthodox Christianity replaced local religious practices, and Byzantine legal codes supplanted tribal customs. The Byzantine military machine became so effective that it created what historians call the Byzantine Millennium, a period when the Eastern Roman Empire was simultaneously fighting successful wars against Islamic armies in the east, Bulgarian kingdoms in the north, and Italian city-states in the west. By the year 1000, Byzantium controlled more territory than it had since the early 7th century, and was recognized as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. The defensive empire of the 9th century had become the aggressive superpower of the 10th century. Fact number 4. The Islamic world produced military geniuses who reconquered half of everything. The fragmented Islamic dynasties discovered that political division didn't prevent military excellence, producing commanders who reconquered Sicily, terrorized Byzantium, and established Islamic kingdoms that lasted for centuries. The Islamic military revival began in multiple centers simultaneously. In Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate, 909 to 1171, established itself as a rival to the Abbasids, and began systematic expansion across North Africa and into the Levant. In Al-Andalus, the Umayyad Caliphate reached its peak under Abd al-Rahman III, 912 to 961, who conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula and established Cordoba as one of Europe's most magnificent cities. The most dramatic Islamic success was the conquest of Sicily by the Aghlabid dynasty, 827 to 902. The systematic Islamic conquest of Sicily was a masterpiece of medieval military planning, combining naval superiority, siege warfare, and diplomatic manipulation to eliminate Byzantine control over the central Mediterranean. Islamic military success in the 10th century was based on superior organization, technology, and tactics. Islamic armies combined disciplined infantry, mobile cavalry, and sophisticated siege equipment in ways that European armies couldn't match. Islamic naval forces controlled Mediterranean trade routes and could project power across water barriers that protected European territories. The intellectual and cultural achievements of 10th century Islamic civilization were as impressive as the military conquests. Cordoba became a center of learning that preserved classical texts, advanced mathematical knowledge, and produced philosophical works that influenced European thought for centuries. Islamic architectural achievements in the 10th century rivaled anything being built in Europe. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, expanded under Abd al-Rahman III, demonstrated Islamic artistic sophistication that made European churches look primitive by comparison. Most importantly, Islamic civilization in the 10th century proved that political fragmentation could coexist with cultural unity and military effectiveness. Competing Islamic dynasties maintained religious coherence while developing distinct regional characteristics that enriched rather than weakened Islamic civilization. Fact number 5. The Vikings founded Russia, and nobody realized what they'd done. Swedish Vikings traveling down Russian rivers to trade with Byzantium accidentally created the political foundation for what would eventually become the largest country in the world, establishing governmental structures that survived for over 1,000 years. The Viking expansion into Russia began as a commercial enterprise. Swedish traders realized that the river systems of Eastern Europe provided a direct route from Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, bypassing the dangerous overland routes controlled by various hostile tribes. The key to Viking success in Russia was their ability to adapt to riverine warfare and diplomacy. Instead of relying purely on naval superiority, the Vikings learned to portage their ships between river systems, negotiate with Slavic tribes, and establish fortified trading posts that could serve as both commercial centers and military bases. Rurik, 862 to 879, established Viking control over Novgorod, while Oleg, 879 to 912, conquered Kiev and united the northern and southern Viking territories into a single political entity. The Kievan Rus became a hybrid civilization that combined Scandinavian military traditions, Slavic agricultural systems, and Byzantine commercial relationships. The Viking rulers of Russia maintained their Scandinavian identity while adapting to local conditions. They preserved Norse legal traditions while incorporating Slavic customs, maintained diplomatic relationships with Scandinavia while developing closer ties to Byzantium, and continued Viking military practices while adapting to continental European warfare. The conversion of Vladimir I, 980 to 1015, to Orthodox Christianity completed the transformation of Viking Russia into a European kingdom. The mass baptism of Kiev, 988, marked the beginning of Russian Orthodox Christianity and the end of pagan Scandinavian religion in Eastern Europe. Most remarkably, the Viking establishment of Russian statehood created governmental structures that would influence Russian political development for centuries. The concept of autocratic rule, the relationship between church and state, and the territorial organization of the Russian Empire all traced their origins to 10th century Viking innovations. By 1000, the Kievan Rus was recognized as a major European power, whose rulers corresponded with emperors and kings as equals. The Swedish traders who had begun the century as commercial adventurers had ended it as the founders of a civilization. Fact number 6. The Fatimids created a counter-caliphate and made it work. The Fatimid dynasty established itself as a rival to the Abbasid Caliphate and proved that the Islamic world was big enough for competing claims to religious authority, creating one of medieval history's most successful revolutionary movements. The Fatimids began as a Shia movement in North Africa that rejected Abbasid religious authority and claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima. This wasn't just political rebellion. It was religious revolution that challenged the fundamental basis of Islamic governmental legitimacy. The Fatimid conquest of Egypt, 969, established Cairo as a rival to Baghdad and created a Shia caliphate that controlled territories from Morocco to Syria. The Fatimids didn't just claim equal status with the Abbasids. They claimed superior religious authority based on their alleged prophetic lineage. Fatimid success was based on superior military organization, economic resources, and religious appeal. Their armies combined Berber tribal warriors, Turkish slave soldiers, and local Egyptian forces in military systems that could challenge both Byzantine and Abbasid power. The Fatimid Caliphate became one of the wealthiest states in the medieval world through control of Mediterranean trade routes and Egyptian agricultural resources. Cairo developed into a commercial center that rivaled Constantinople and Baghdad, while Fatimid naval forces dominated the eastern Mediterranean. The religious and cultural achievements of the Fatimid Caliphate were as impressive as their political success. Al-Azhar University, founded in 970, became one of the Islamic world's most important centers of religious learning. Fatimid patronage of arts and sciences produced architectural monuments and scholarly works that influenced Islamic civilization for centuries. Most importantly, the Fatimid Caliphate proved that the Islamic world could sustain competing claims to religious authority without fragmenting into sectarian warfare. Sunni and Shia dynasties competed politically while maintaining religious and cultural connections that preserved Islamic unity. By 1000, the Fatimid Caliphate controlled territories that rivaled the Abbasid Empire and was recognized as a legitimate Islamic authority by rulers throughout the medieval world. Fact number 7. England became a real kingdom instead of a Viking theme park. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which had spent the 9th century being systematically conquered by Danish Vikings, pulled off one of medieval history's most impressive comebacks by uniting under Alfred the Great's successors and reconquering their own country. The English reconquest began with Edward the Elder, 899 to 924, and Ethelflaed of Mercia, Alfred's son and daughter, who developed systematic strategies for recapturing Danish-controlled territories. Their approach combined military innovation, diplomatic manipulation, and administrative reform in ways that turned temporary military victories into permanent political control. The key to English success was the Boer system, fortified towns that served as military bases, administrative centers, and commercial hubs. Each boer could defend its surrounding territory while supporting offensive operations against Danish settlements. The Boer network created defensive depth that made Viking raiding uneconomical. Aethelstan, 924 to 939, completed the military reconquest and established himself as the first king to rule all of England. His victory at Brunanburh, 937, eliminated the last significant Viking resistance and established English royal authority from the Scottish border to the English Channel. The English governmental system that emerged from the Reconquest was remarkably sophisticated. The Anglo-Saxon legal codes, administrative systems, and military organization combined English traditions with lessons learned from fighting Vikings. English kings developed institutional structures that survived the Norman conquest and influenced English governance for centuries. The English Church became a major force in European Christianity, producing scholars, missionaries, and administrators who served throughout medieval Europe. English monasteries preserved classical texts, developed distinctive artistic traditions, and maintained diplomatic relationships with Rome and continental European religious centers. Most importantly, the English reconquest proved that Viking military superiority wasn't permanent and that European kingdoms could adapt, learn, and eventually overcome nomadic advantages through superior organization and institutional development. By 1000, England was recognized as a major European kingdom whose military, governmental, and religious institutions served as models for other medieval societies. Fact number 8. The Church invented institutional reform and accidentally created papal supremacy. The 10th century Church reform movement, which began as an attempt to clean up clerical corruption and lay interference, accidentally created the ideological foundation for papal monarchy and religious warfare that would define medieval European politics. The reform movement began at Cluny Abbey, 910, where monks developed new models of religious life that emphasized spiritual discipline, institutional autonomy, and direct papal authority. The Cluniac reforms spread throughout Europe, creating networks of reformed monasteries that challenged traditional relationships between religious and secular authority. The Church reform movement addressed real problems: clerical marriage, simony, occupying church offices, and lay investiture, secular rulers appointing church officials, had corrupted religious institutions throughout Europe. The reformers argued that the church could only fulfill its spiritual mission if it maintained independence from secular political pressures. The intellectual framework for church reform was developed by scholars who argued that spiritual authority was superior to temporal authority, and that the Pope, as Christ's representative on earth, had ultimate jurisdiction over all Christian rulers. This wasn't just religious theory, it was political revolution disguised as theological scholarship. The Reform movement gained political power when it allied with the Holy Roman Empire against local nobles who had been exploiting church resources for personal benefit. The alliance between reforming popes and German emperors eliminated lay interference in church affairs, while establishing papal authority over religious institutions throughout Europe. The unintended consequence of church reform was the creation of papal monarchy. By establishing the principle that the Pope had ultimate authority over religious matters, the reformers created institutional structures that would eventually challenge secular political authority throughout medieval Europe. The Peace of God movement, which began in the late 10th century, extended church authority into secular affairs by establishing religious rules for warfare, property rights, and social relationships. The church began claiming jurisdiction over matters that had traditionally been controlled by secular rulers. By 1000, the Reformed Church had become an independent political institution with its own legal system, financial resources, and territorial authority. The religious reform movement had accidentally created the foundation for church-state conflicts that would define medieval European politics. Fact number 9. The Islamic world perfected medieval urban civilization. While European towns were still struggling to maintain basic sanitation and security, Islamic cities in the 10th century developed urban systems that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance, creating standards of living that made European visitors feel like barbarians. The achievement of 10th century Islamic urban civilization was most visible in Cordoba, which under Abd al-Rahman III became the largest and most sophisticated city in Europe. With a population approaching 500,000, Cordoba had paved streets, public baths, hospitals, libraries, and sewage systems that made Paris and London look like primitive villages. Islamic urban planning in the 10th century combined practical engineering with aesthetic sophistication. Cities were designed around central mosques, markets, and administrative centers, with residential districts organized by profession and social status. Water systems provided clean drinking water and waste removal that eliminated the disease problems plaguing European towns. The intellectual achievements of Islamic urban civilization were as impressive as the physical infrastructure. Baghdad's House of Wisdom, Cairo's Al-Azhar University, and Cordoba's libraries preserved classical texts, advanced mathematical and scientific knowledge, and produced philosophical works that influenced European thought for centuries. Islamic commercial systems in the 10th century created the medieval world's most sophisticated banking, credit, and trade networks. Islamic merchants operated throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia, using financial instruments and commercial practices that wouldn't be adopted in Europe until centuries later. The cultural achievements of Islamic cities influenced European development in ways that Europeans barely recognized. Islamic architectural techniques, artistic motifs, and literary forms spread throughout Europe through commercial contacts and diplomatic exchanges. Most importantly, Islamic urban civilization in the 10th century demonstrated alternative approaches to medieval social organization that challenged European assumptions about politics, religion, and cultural development. Fact number 10. The 10th century proved medieval civilization could learn from its mistakes. The most mind-blowing fact about the 10th century is that it demonstrated medieval society's capacity for adaptation, innovation, and systematic problem-solving in ways that directly contradicted the chaos and fragmentation of the 9th century. Every major success of the 10th century represented lessons learned from 9th century failures. The Holy Roman Empire succeeded because it solved the Carolingian problems of succession, administration, and defense. The Hungarian kingdom succeeded because it learned from Magyar military defeats. The English reconquest succeeded because it adapted Viking military innovations. The 10th century established patterns of institutional development that would define medieval European civilization for centuries. The relationship between church and state, the balance between centralized and decentralized authority, and the integration of different cultural traditions all emerged from 10th century innovations. Medieval societies in the 10th century proved they could maintain cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances. Vikings became Christians without losing their martial traditions. Magyars became Europeans without abandoning their distinctive culture. Islamic dynasties competed politically while preserving religious unity. The 10th century also demonstrated that political fragmentation didn't necessarily mean civilizational decline. Multiple competing kingdoms could coexist, learn from each other, and develop innovations that strengthened rather than weakened medieval European civilization. Most importantly, the 10th century established medieval Europe's characteristic resilience, the capacity to recover from disasters, adapt to changing circumstances, and build stronger institutions from the ruins of what came before. By 1000 Anno Domini, medieval civilization had proven that the chaos of the 9th century wasn't inevitable decline, but growing pains. The medieval world had learned how to fight back, and it was just getting started.